think about what you want to get from our conversation. I will formally introduce Jess, and I'll introduce myself if you don't know who I am. So Jess is here. She is a full-time human being, adventurer, part-time van lifer, dog mom, wife, sourdough enthusiast, and co-founder of the FIoneers. She's a part-time writer, speaker, and lifestyle design coach, and she loves helping people design lives they truly love. Jess is child-free by choice, loves being outdoors, and has a home based in the very high cost of living Boston area when she's not traveling in her camper van. And for those of you who don't know me, I am Lindsay. I'm a mixed Filipina auntie. I am indoorsy. I'm a Midwesterner. I'm a Virgo sun, Enneagram 8 soul, and I'm the founder of Mind Money Balance. At Mind Money Balance, I'm a certified financial therapist, and I provide shame-free education, speaking, therapy, consulting at the intersection of money and mental health. I love a good pop culture podcast, planning my partner and I's next travel hacking based trip, and spoiling my Portuguese water dog. So let's start right away. Jess, tell us, what the heck is FIRE and what first attracted you to FIRE?
Sure. So FIRE stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early. And I will say that I don't know if I was first attracted initially to full FIRE or just the concept of financial independence. So let me sort of distinguish those. Financial independence is getting to a point in your life where you no longer need to work for income because you have passive income that covers your expenses. FI is something that every single person, I would hope, is striving for, because FI simply means you have the ability to retire comfortably at any age, right? So you could be financially independent at 65. You could be financially independent at 70, right? Or you could pursue FIRE, which is financial independence, retire early, and be seeking to push that retirement date quite a bit earlier into your 50s or your 40s, or for some people with extremely high incomes and very low lifestyle costs, sometimes in their 30s.
Wow. So I just typed into the chat, and for those of you catching the replay, I just want you to do a quick self-check-in. How familiar are you with this concept of FIRE that Jess just explained? Red, nothing. This is the first time you've heard of it. Yellow, you understand the concept. You've maybe listened to a podcast about it or read a book about it, but you're not necessarily changing any of your behaviors. Or green, you're like firmly in it. You're a part of the movement. You're working on increasing your savings rate so you can potentially leave the workforce earlier. So we have orange, green, yellow. Yeah. And I'm also kind of in that like yellow green. And that's why I wanted to bring you on, Jess, because my frustration with, we have a couple more coming in. Yellow, green. Okay. This person shared that they had to do disability FI since they were tired of seeing it taught by able-bodied people. Yes. Okay, so you are in the right place, because part of my frustration with the FIRE movement is that so many people who had initially popularized earning a lot of money and retiring early were the people who already had several layers of privilege that they didn't necessarily address, right? They were software engineers. They worked in low cost of living areas. They were able to work remotely. And so they already had so many advantages that they didn't necessarily address, and made it kind of feel like, well, if you just save and put yourself first, then you can retire early and never have to work again, without really addressing that not everybody had the same type of access to that, nor does everyone want to live their life in the exact same way. Like when I first stumbled upon it, I remember reading people's I don't know, Jess, if this was in your purview when you were kind of familiarizing yourself with it, but I would read people's monthly income and spending diaries, and people would be doing things like taking home rolls of toilet paper from work to save money, or purposely like doing weird things like not washing their hands till they got to the office so they didn't have to use their own hand soap. Like there were these things that were just so next level and so extreme that just didn't feel approachable. And it's really easy, in my opinion, to save something like 60, 70, 80% of your income when you have an income that is in the six or multiple six figures. But it didn't really address a person like one of the people here today who has a chronic illness or a disability. It didn't address people who had lots of kids or lived in a high cost of living area. It just felt very narrow-minded. And so I'm like, I like this. There's something cool here about leaving the workforce when you decide, but there was something amiss. So what the heck is SlowFi, or slow financial independence? And is it really that different from the FIRE concept that you explained earlier?
Yeah, that's a great question. So backing up a little bit, I really identify with what you had to say about when you heard about FIRE initially. I think that was similar to my own response, right? I think there were two things that I experienced when I learned about FIRE initially. The first one was, wow, there are people out there who are actually designing lives that they truly love. Like they're figuring out, this is what I love to do, and they're making it happen. To me, that was so incredibly surprising for some reason, right? Like I think I'd always had this assumption that I would work until the age of 65, hopefully in a job I didn't hate, but was like in a really toxic job at the time. And so it felt like it was like a breath of fresh air. Like there was a question that was asked in one of the books that I read was, what would you do if you didn't need to work for money? And I didn't have an answer to it. I was so disconnected from myself and what I wanted at that point in time that I was like, I literally have no answer to this question, but I was hooked and felt like I needed to figure it out. And so I felt like the draw for me about like financial independence and the FIRE movement was more of the lifestyle piece of like, what do you want your life to look like? And if there were no barriers, like what could your life look like? And then like work backward, right? From a life with no barriers to then incorporate, okay, how am I going to work through these sometimes real and sometimes mental barriers that are keeping me from achieving this. So that was the positive side of FIRE. I think the negative side of FIRE was, I saw a ton of people front loading the work, enduring toxic jobs.
Mm-hmm.
And I did not hear ever of someone deciding to wait until to get to work to wash their hands. Like that seems insane.
Yeah, this was obviously pre-COVID days, but it still grossed me out then. I was like, really? You're not going to use soap at your house?
Oh my goodness. Yeah, that is too much. But definitely, was hearing about the people who were like eating beans and rice and like having their average food cost be like $2 a meal or something. And, and sort of me looking at that and being like, I value eating healthy food and lots of vegetables and, a balanced diet. And I'm not going to eat, whatever. Right. So that was one of them. And then like people who sort of like refused to drive cars and, like rode their bike everywhere. I do ride my bike a lot of places now. But that is like, that's a choice based on like, that's a thing that I want to do versus like, this is a thing that I'm doing because I have to like save money at all costs so that I can retire as early as I possibly can.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was, I mean, so that's kind of the backdrop of it. Right. And so I learned about this and I was like, okay, I want to figure out the lifestyle piece. I want to figure out like, what would I do if I didn't need to work for income and like figure out how to move that forward and make that a reality in my life. While at the same time, this whole like FIRE approach, like that's not going to work for me. Right. And so at the time I was already in a toxic job. Right. I was working 50 to 60 hours a week, commuting 90 minutes each way, had a pretty toxic boss at the time. And honestly, it was seriously like 2 weeks after I was like, okay, this FIRE thing is interesting. Let's like, I really want to like commit to like figuring out what I want. I had a mental health crisis. And started having panic attacks and severe anxiety and actually had to take about 6 months off of work. Right. And so for me, it was like, okay, well, clearly this FIRE approach is not going to work for me because I can't, like, my body is physically telling me you cannot endure this for another 10 years or 15 years, right? Or however long it would take to reach full financial independence. Right. And for people who have a high paying job and no debt and, you know, are like able to reach financial independence really quickly, by all means, go ahead and do that in your 20s. Right. That wasn't a possibility for me. I worked in nonprofit for my entire career. I started out making $11,000 a year through AmeriCorps, living right outside New York City. Right? Like,
oh my gosh, all the nonprofiters here are like, been there. Oh,
yeah, exactly. And so, and you know, I had increased my income over time, but did not start out with a kind of salary that would have allowed me to reach FIRE quickly. You know, and so there are a number of things right. So all of this stuff sort of came together for me to say, like, I want to pursue financial independence and I want to build this life where I can decide what would I love to do if I no longer needed to work for income and then work toward that lifestyle. But I'm not going to do that at the expense of my life, my mental health, my physical health, my relationships. Right. And, you know, all of those things. And so I would say that's kind of how SlowFI was born, right? It was through this idea of saying, like, the journey, we believe that the journey should be as remarkable as the destination. And we can use the financial freedom that we build all along the way. Like, it isn't about reaching this specific FI number where we never have to work again, that there are ways to use financial freedom along the way to grab hold of a lot of that freedom before, right? So I guess examples of that would be, you know, one is having emergency savings. And I like to call that FU money. Right. And I think
I love a good reframe also. So anytime we can reframe or rebrand it, I'm like, yes, let's do it. Okay.
Yeah.
Love it.
So like, I love that. Like, yeah. And so, you know, it was funny. I actually learned about the concept of FU money like 2 weeks before my mental breakdown.
Wow.
And I think that it was like subconsciously I just knew. It was like, I have this. Like, I have an emergency fund. And the point of an emergency fund is to get you out of a bad situation or help you to take advantage of an opportunity. Like, it allows you to say F you to someone who's making your life miserable or a situation that's making your life miserable. And so I think that was like part of what was like, okay, you can, you know, take this 6 months off from work because I realized like, oh, I do have this emergency fund. And like, this is the point of having it, is so that we can get ourselves out of these bad situations, right? Or one of the reasons, I would say, right? So FU money is incredibly powerful. And then, you know, I think there's other pieces too, right? So one thing, a concept that I've learned about in the last few years is called coast financial independence. And that's the idea that you get to a point where you've invested enough for your traditional retirement that all you need to do from now till the age of 65 or whatever, age you want to retire, you only need to cover your actual expenses.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in there and we'll keep going, but I heard so much that I wanted to do like a couple of recaps and then I'll let you keep going. I promise. Yes. So first of all, thank you for being so transparent with us about your experience hitting that mental health crisis. I think, we love to think that we're in this age of everything is destigmatized, but it can still be really hard to say like, hey, I wasn't just burned out. I was experiencing severe anxiety and panic attacks. So thank you for sharing that with us. And we're so glad to hear that you're feeling better and you were able to listen to yourself. And I also know in our conversation last week that you wanted to really reiterate that people don't have to hit that wall. They don't have to hit a physical, mental, or emotional crisis before they make changes. And I think in our society, we really wait for a crisis to happen before we shift gears. And I love that you kind of share, look, I did have that crisis moment, but you don't have to get to that point. And the other couple of things that I heard you say, you were really doing a great job of kind of taking this brain jumble in my head about why I struggled so much with FIRE and articulating it nicely and succinctly. But I found that with a lot of folks, at least when I first was introduced to the FIRE movement, it was like they were replacing grinding at work with grinding outside of work, right? Like they would work and shovel away all of this money, but at what cost, right? They weren't necessarily interacting with friends or family or maybe taking care of their mental, emotional, and spiritual health, right? They were laser focused on just increasing their income, but there didn't seem to be a well-roundedness in it. And that's why I feel like your approach to SlowFI, or as you mentioned, you heard about CoastFi, just feels so much more sustainable, and not even just sustainable, but achievable. I think for a lot of people, FIRE seems like only for a person or people who have like a very unique subset of criteria and interest and motivations, but yours just seems so much more well-rounded. So I really appreciate that piece too. I'll let you keep going. So you're talking about like a couple of the things that were helpful when kind of coining SlowFi or finding out about SlowFi, and you left off by, here's what I was going to say. You left off by telling us about CoastFi. I will find Jess's CoastFi calculator that she and her partner created. It is totally free, but you can plug in your numbers and kind of get a sense of how much you're earning now, how much you're saving now, and how close or far you are from being able to stop contributing to your retirement, right? Did I describe that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So yeah. And I realize I'm telling kind of this like long story to get to like, what SlowFi is.
No, it's great. I love it.
But I think, so then I learned about this cool CoastFi idea, and realized like, okay, like, especially for people who are coming at this at like a fairly young age, it's a surprisingly low amount of money that you need to be fully to be CoastFi, right? To say, okay, all I need to do now is let my money compound over the next 30 years. Yeah, right. I did some calculations, I think, for someone who makes or who spends like $50,000 a year. I would say I probably need to do the math, but it's like it's like if someone's 35, they only need like 250,000 to be CoastFi, which I will say 250,000 is still a lot of money. But that's the money that's going to grow to be like 1.5 million by the time you're 65 to be able to cover, to like allow you to be fully FI at that point and not need to depend on income. And so if you look at it that way, then it's like, okay, this is a little bit more doable.
That's super helpful.
Yeah. Right. And
Can you do
yeah.
I'm just going to interject because I know
Yeah.
some people here are new to some of these terms.
Yeah.
Can you give us like a quick primer on how to calculate your full FI number?
Mhm.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. So, in terms of what you would need to be fully financially independent and never need to work again, you would need your annual expenses and multiply that by 25.
Yes. So
Yeah.
25x your annual
Mhm.
expenses. That is full
Yep.
FI. You don't have to work again. You can safely live off of the money that you'd invested. And so when you're
Mhm.
talking about Coast FI, it sounds like instead of having like 25x, you need like 6x.
It depends on your age, and it
Okay,
depends, so
great.
right? And so it depends
Yeah.
on how like the time horizon that you
Okay.
have for it to
Yeah.
compound.
Right.
So the younger you are, the lower amount, like the lower it is.
Got it. Because you're going to stay in the
Mhm.
workforce
Yep.
and not have to worry about contributing more to your retirement. And if I'm
Mhm.
kind of reading
Yep.
back between the lines there, the benefit is then if you have done that, you've hit Coast FI, that means that you probably then have the flexibility to choose an income source that just covers your expenses. So that
Mhm.
might mean you go from
Yep.
working full time to part time, or maybe you're still full
Mhm.
time, but you're in a much less stressful job or one that lets you work remotely, things like that. Okay,
Yep, exactly.
beautiful.
Or
Okay,
maybe
cool.
people go the self-employment route, do freelance or
Yes.
contract work, start their own
Yes.
business. Yeah, so a number of different things that people
Cool.
can do to with more flexibility.
I love that.
Yeah, and so I learned about that. So after my mental health crisis, I went back to work part-time, and originally when I did that, I was like, okay, after like 6 months or so, I'll probably like work full time again and we'll continue, working toward this financial independence thing. And two things happened in that 6 months. So one is we learned about Coast Fi, and two, we realized that when I wasn't so stressed out and burned out, we spent so much less money. And
Oh my gosh. Of course. Like all these things
Mhm.
are clicking into
Yeah,
place. Yes, because so
yeah.
many of us, not to, obviously here we're not about being shame based or blaming people, but one of the most accessible coping skills for us is spending money because it's predictable. It releases dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin. Like it quite literally is
Mhm.
one of the things when we have found in research that mimics other types of things that release that serotonin dopamine kind of mix, like
Mhm.
drinking, drugging,
Yeah.
sugar, sex, right? It is like right
Mhm.
up there with the
Yeah.
things that feels the best. So I love
Yep.
that when you were less stressed, naturally your spending decreased. Okay, continue on.
Mhm. Yeah, I think part of it was this stuff that was like, "Oh, I deserve this," or like, I'm gonna buy this thing and it makes me feel good for a second, and it was also a lot of convenience. So, it was a lot of takeout, it was a lot of, like, easy to make stuff at the grocery store that's more expensive, it was a lot of that convenience as well. Um, so we were close to Coast Fi at that time. We weren't quite there yet. Um, but we realized that because we were spending so much less, like we weren't actually like it wasn't having that much of an impact on our finances and our financial goals for me to be making a lot less money. And so I just decided, okay, I'm gonna keep working part-time. Um, and then we eventually reached Coast Fi within the next year or so. And then,
Can we just
when
celebrate
yeah,
that for a minute? That's a big deal, Jess.
yeah.
Like,
Thank you.
yeah, we eventually reached Coast 5. That's huge.
Yeah.
Okay, keep going.
Yeah, and
We have to
so
celebrate our wins.
yeah, and I guess one thing that I would say is, like, even with scaled back work and starting to take these steps to design a better life along the path, we still were working toward our financial goals, right? We may have reached them slightly slower, than we would have if like I was continuing to work full time in my crazy toxic job. But that didn't matter because life was better.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So you sort of already answered this already, but I was reading your how you came to SlowFi and how you define it and what makes it different for you to be applicable for you.
Mhm.
But you have this interesting statement where you say SlowFi is the true YOLO. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So when I think of like you only live once, a lot of times it seems like people are like, well, I only live once, so I'm going to buy this big thing, or I'm going to go to this concert. I'm going to like take this super expensive trip or something that's like, because YOLO, I only live once kind of thing. And a lot of it centers around spending money. And one thing that I've realized is like living my best life has very little to do with stuff and like the stuff that I'm spending money on beyond my basic needs and beyond the things that really enhance the experiences, right? That I'm going to have. I will say that. But for the most part, it's about having freedom and time and autonomy to be able to do the things that matter most to me. And so for me, SlowFi means I get to work less.
Yes.
And then when I work less, right, that means that I have more time to focus on the things that I value and the experiences that I want to have in my life. And so when I think of only live once, I would so much rather be doing those things rather than working as hard as I possibly can to make as much money as possible so that I can cover these, crazy, so that I can buy anything that I want.
Yeah.
Right. And spend as much money.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And it's also, not to be morbid or bring us down, but you also hear of folks who work their whole lives. They work till they're 62, 67, 70. And it's like, as soon as they retire, this is not uncommon, but then something tragic happens. They end up with a chronic illness, or they're not able to be as mobile as they thought they were, or sometimes, they die prematurely. And it's like we put off all of living our life until later. And so when you're talking about SlowFi being YOLO, I heard you say designing things that are maybe a little less grand in scale, but are still grand to you personally. And that might mean working part-time. It might mean taking a little bit more time, hitting some of those goals, but also making sure that you're enjoying it along the way. You have this statement in that same post about SlowFi that I want to read. You said, quote, like slow food and slow travel, SlowFi focuses on the process, connection to the world and people around us, and our experiences along the journey. SlowFi enables us to live our best lives along the way. So I would love for folks who are hearing that definition just to sit with that and think, if I were to take that approach to designing a life that is good now and good later, what's the one thing that I could do or would do differently if I adopted that SlowFi mindset? So noodle on that, share what you're thinking. Jess gave some great ideas about how she's living her life in alignment with this SlowFi mindset, but would love to hear from other folks what comes up as even a possibility. And I say even as a possibility because for so many of us, we've only seen a particular way to live our lives, and that is work for 40 years, retire, maybe travel for a little bit if you're lucky. And that's kind of the way that we've been conditioned, is to go to school for 1,000,000 years, work for 1,000,000 years, and maybe get a few years to put your feet up. So what's one thing you do differently now? If you'd adopted the SlowFi mindset, go ahead and type it in the comments. So as people are brainstorming the things that they might be able to do differently, I want to address that for many people, particularly folks who are, you and I are millennials, we've faced so many challenges financially, the economy, student loans, et cetera. But particularly for millennials and Gen Z generations, they might feel like, look, I'm already behind, Jess, and you're talking about saving more and working part-time. And they might also be in a place in their lives where they're working on some of those foundations. They're working on an FU fund. They are working on finding a spending plan that works for them. They are working on paying down their student loans. So what would you say to someone who is SlowFI curious? They're enjoying our conversation. They can imagine it, but they have that like little gremlin on their shoulder that's like, that's not for you. How would you kind of address these real barriers to somebody who's interested and wants to take the first step, but they're just feeling overwhelmed with all of these competing financial demands?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess the first thing that I would say is that SlowFi actually puts the lifestyle you want at the center and then allows you to build up those good financial habits to support what you want. And so I don't feel like living a SlowFi lifestyle and still needing to work on your finances are like different things that are like in contrast to each other. I think the whole point is we can do both at the same time. And so what I would encourage people to do, regardless of where they are on their financial journey, is to start to think about, what does your ideal lifestyle look like? What would be your ideal average day? Right? What are the kinds of things that you would want to do if you could every day, every week, every month, every year, right? And could you start to incorporate some of those things into your life immediately? I think sometimes we say, oh, I will do X when I get to Y, right? And I think we don't, SlowFi says you don't need to do that, right? SlowFi says most of those things don't actually require a lot of money. Like sometimes doing it in the amount that you want requires more freedom and more money, but doing it at all usually doesn't. And so how can we start to incorporate those things into our life immediately, right? And start to think about, what are the things we want in our life long term? And how can we start experimenting with those in the time that we have right now, right? And do that immediately. And so I would say you're figuring out, right, these good financial habits, and every single thing you do has a ton of lifestyle benefits, right? And so I think one thing to remember is, like, it isn't just, oh, I have to get to this like big, massive financial milestone and then there will be lifestyle benefits. It's like, no, every single dollar that you save brings you closer to having these lifestyle benefits, whether it's the FU money, whether it's, getting to CoastFi, whether like whatever it is, can, one, help you make some lifestyle change, or two, give you a feeling of freedom, right? I think sometimes having this FU fund and knowing, like, if I left my job, I would be okay, like, can give us a feeling of freedom to set boundaries at work too, right? And so it's not necessarily that you have to make some sort of big, massive change, right? We can use this to give ourselves a feeling of freedom to start to tweak things, right? How do I make X area of my life 20 to 30% better immediately, right? Which then gives me more space to dream bigger about what I could want in the future.
Yeah.
Right. And so, yeah, so it's like the financial habits build right? To allow you to have those feelings of freedom, to be able to dream bigger. And I think once we get those financial habits to a good place, right? Like you don't have to focus on the money anymore. And I think that's the goal.
Yeah.
Right? Getting good with money is not that's not the end goal. The end goal is to have the better life.
Yes.
And
yes.
that's a much more motivating goal for me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a much more motivating goal. And it's also, I shared with you before we went live, like I'm really struggling with post-COVID fatigue, and it's been I don't wish it upon anybody. And it's been very helpful for me as a person who loves my spreadsheets and loves to plan, not just like financially, but also where are we going to travel, when, what is the agenda going to be when we go on this trip, all of these different things. And my body saying like, you have to rest, you have to slow down, you have to go to sleep like this minute is also a very helpful reminder that I can race towards those things, but it will only be to my own detriment, right? That's a very literal example of how slowing down is showing up in my life right now. I want to read some of the things that people shared they might do if they embraced this SlowFI mindset. It sounds like a lot of the things you were sharing, but much like you, Jess, I always like to hear what people are dreaming of. Kelsey shared they'd have more time and space for writing and connecting with writing communities. Anya shared work a little bit less, free up more time for hobbies and travel so much more. Chelsea, living life with more intentionality and focusing more on fostering authentic human connections. Minnie, making sure the transition is smooth to FI because there is a disability component there. And then also traveling to Europe with kids. This is really interesting. They say, we want to take our adult children with us before they are too busy. I've seen others wait and it never happens, right? And we see this all the time. I will do that when I hit a certain age, when I have enough in my bank account, when I've accrued X number of PTO days. But what you're saying, Jess, that fits in with this person's observation is that it is not an either or, but it is a both and. Yes, maybe we take some long weekends now. And as we build up our travel fund, then we can take the long Euro trip. But it doesn't mean we don't ever travel until we have enough money to go to Europe.
Yeah. And one additional thing I think that inspired me was I started seeing a lot of the like early financial independence FIRE like influencers actually reaching FI. Right. And a lot of them got there and then were like, oh, this
now
doesn't
what?
actually fit. Being fired doesn't actually fix all of my problems. Like it just exacerbates them and shows me that like, oh, now I don't have excuses for the fact that I have these problems and I have to solve them. And many were like, and now what? Like, what am I going to do? And so I saw that and was like, well, I don't want that to happen either. Like, why would I push through to get to this place that's potentially like not necessarily better if I don't experiment and try to figure out what I want anyways? And knowing that the vast majority of the things that we want, we can still do while we're working. So like, why would I put this all off and sacrifice and endure, this sort of lifestyle of always focusing on the grind and of making more money and saving more money when like the whole purpose of finances is not finances.
Exactly. I'm going to repeat that sentence. The whole purpose of finances is not finances. Keep going.
Yeah. Right. And so that was inspiring to me to see like, I don't know, right? Like these people are doing this and they're getting to this like really impressive financial milestone, but then they're turning around and saying things like, my path was a death march. Don't do it this way.
Whoa. Yeah. And Kelsey shared in the chat as you were talking about what you had witnessed with peers who were in the financial independence community, Kelsey said, I imagine they were also so isolated from their community after years of being absent and uninvolved. Yeah, when we have our tunnel vision on towards a specific goal that is incredibly isolating, it's not great. Another person says, I get so wrapped up in the money part and not the independence part that I forget that I need to come back to that independence part. Jess, you mentioned this word experiment a couple times. What does experimentation have to do with SlowFI?
Yeah. So I guess I think of like what is the way that we figure anything out, right? And I think anything for ourselves out is often through experimentation. Like we can't actually sit back and think about it and journal and reflect and just like noodle on ideas. We won't actually know if we want to move toward any of them without trying them out. And so I actually often think of like every action that I take feels like an experiment. Right. And I think, like this is a place that took a while to get to. But I would say something's an experiment if you're trying to answer some sort of question or to learn something about yourself or about the thing that you're doing. And so I think lifestyle design, which is like sort of at the core of SlowFi, is all about experimentation. We can, and it is very helpful to figure out what are our core values, what are the things that we love to do, what are important things about my nature that will enable me to thrive, right? And to have some process to dream big, right? But all of those things, like they'll just stay in the theoretical if we don't actually take action and experiment. So
yeah. I attended your SlowFi meetup all about experimentation and lifestyle design. And it was so parallel to the way that I have shifted my thinking over the past few years, because again, we're kind of raised, for those of us in the US and Canada, we share a lot of similar kind of cultural norms and values or indoctrination to take it a little far, that is like, everything you do, you have to research and plan and do it right and do it well and execute appropriately so you get an A or so you keep your job or whatever the thing is. And we really don't learn how to experiment and how to make mistakes and how to test out a hypothesis, right? Outside of our one, science week in grade 5 or grade 6, where we had our little science experiments and tried out a few different things, we don't really replicate that much as adults. And I loved some of the examples you shared when I attended that SlowFi meetup. Like, for example, if you're a person and you say, oh my gosh, my partner and I would love to, I live in the Midwest where it's freezing cold in the wintertime. My partner and I would love to spend February, which is one of the coldest months, in Mexico or in Costa Rica, right? And you have this great idea and it feels really exciting and feels really good, but you haven't visited Mexico before, or you haven't been to Costa Rica in a decade. You would argue then to do something like take a 10-day vacation there, see what you like, see what you don't like. Are you able to cope with, limited Wi-Fi and downpours of rain that might wash out the rain or might wash out the roads? Do you feel like your Spanish is good enough to get by, or do you feel like you would want to live in an area that have a lot of expats? And if so, is that really the lifestyle that you're envisioning? So when I hear you talk about lifestyle, experimenting as a part of SlowFi, as a part of lifestyle design, I also hear you saying like experiment is another way to say a test run or a trial run. And you and your partner did that before you transitioned to having a van, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, we say, so I think there's like 3 different types of experiments, and none are do internet research. You can do internet research to prepare yourself for an experiment.
All of us Virgos just go into hiding. We're like, what do you mean?
So the 3 types of experiments are: you have a conversation, you go and observe something, right? Or you actually do your own like beta test or test run. And so for us, so we transitioned to part-time van life. We bought a camper van and built it out last year. And in order to do that, right, we did a number of different things. So first, conversations. We had conversations with people who had camper vans about their experience with them. I would say watching YouTube videos of like people doing van life is like close enough to an observation. Like you're observing what someone else's daily life kind of looks like, though it is good to get people who tell you about the ups and downs and not just the ups. So that's important too, because some of that can be rose-colored glasses. And then third, we rented a camper van. So we took a trip for like about 2 weeks, and so many of those were experiments. And I think a way to approach it as an experiment well is to say, like, what is this big idea that I have, right? And so for us, van life, right, was like, this is an interesting thing, but do we want to do it, right? So the first step is to say, let me write down every question I can possibly think of that I have about this idea. Right, so that's everything from like, how much would it cost? Would we even like it? Is it possible to work from the road? Do we like working from the road? Would we like this kind of travel? If we wanted a van, what size would we want? Right? Like every possible thing. And then you can think, and then I say brainstorm as many possible ideas as you can of how to answer those questions with one of those 3 experiment types: a conversation, an observation, or a beta test. And you don't have to do all of them. That's the great thing about brainstorming. I think sometimes we struggle with, um, we struggle with writing things down because we feel like we have to do them. But no, you get to choose like however many of the things from your list as you want. And so, so for us, we, went through those different questions. We rented this camper van and we came back from that trip. Sort of originally our hypothesis was we probably would, we'll rent this camper van for the like 2-week period. And then maybe next year we'll rent one for like a month. And then we'll, figure out, and then we'll like go further. And after that trip, we were like, we absolutely loved this, like way more than we even expected to. And then we were like, do we want to just buy our own van? Rather than and put
renting, right.
Rather than spending the money that we would spend on renting another van, do we wanna just put that into our own?
Yeah.
So we did that, and now that we have the van, I feel like we're still experimenting, right? So it isn't just about like, do we wanna do this van life thing? Okay, we figured it out. Right? Like, we figured out that, we wanted our own van, but now the questions are different. It's
Right.
how long do we wanna travel
Right.
at a time? Do we enjoy this length? What kind of structure do we need to work on the road? And do we enjoy doing the work on the road? Or do we want to plan to have, like, sabbaticals where we don't need to work?
Right.
To travel, or like what are the kinds of places we like to stay? How much like connection do we want to have on the road? I think we thought we were worried that we were not going to have enough connection on the road, but we ended up like seeing way too many people on our trip this spring, and we're like, wow, we need, more.
We need to pull back a little.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
So, and I think there's so many things that you just don't know,
Right.
until you try it.
Right. So I would invite folks to think about what's something that they can start experimenting with, knowing that you don't have to jump into the example I gave of beta testing right away, but you can also chat with other people or listen to podcasts of other people or watch YouTube videos of other people who are living the life or engaging in the type of activity that you want to just kind of start to test the water. So Kelsey said, I'm moving back to the Pacific Northwest in October, and I'll be living in an apartment by the lake in a forest. That's kind of like me beta testing my forest witch dreams. Yes. And beta testing, connecting with other groups that are out there as a part of community. Leanne says, I want to try out some new hobbies and volunteer opportunities, but just choosing what to try is hard. So, Jess, could you address Leanne's kind of like the decision fatigue? And then I want to be mindful of time, and then we'll kind of tie a bow on it.
Sure. So, yeah, I think that's a great question. So I see the question about the anxiety, overcoming the anxiety to get to the experimentation phase and to figure out the types of things that you actually want to do, like choosing. For that, I would say you can start really small. So you can say, like, what is something that I could try out in like a 2-hour block of time? Like, how can I shrink this down to something that feels a little bit more doable? And then the commitment's low, the stakes are low, hopefully, to be able to move forward. One thing that I would also recommend that helped me a lot in moving forward were, one, therapy. So having like a therapist,
this therapist co-signs.
that you could actually like talk through, like, oh, I'm worried about this, or, that kind of thing. The second thing that was really helpful for me was like being part of a community. And actually for me, when I was starting my business, having a coach. So someone who I could be like, I'm really scared or worried, right? Like having a person that you can talk to when those fears come up, who will be encouraging for you and will help you actually work through them, rather than be like, oh yeah, that's probably not going to work, so you might as well not try it. Right. I think we all have a lot of people.
Give it a go. Right.
Yeah. We always have a lot of people in our lives like that, but people who will be really encouraging. So I would say finding a person or a community that can help you work through some of those fears, that also includes people who are moving in the kind of direction that you are interested in moving, because they'll be the right people to help you work through those fears.
Perfect. Thank you for that insight. And as we wrap it up today, if you are joining us live, tell us something you learned today with our conversation, or maybe even learned about yourself during this conversation. And Jessica of the FIoneers, tell us where people can find you if they are very intrigued by lifestyle design and SlowFI. Share with us where they can go.
Yeah, so you can find me on my website, which is thefioneers.com. So it's like pioneers, but with an F, for financial independence. I also have a YouTube channel, which is at FIoneers, and I'm on all the socials as well. I run group coaching programs and a SlowFI focused retreat each year, and you can find information about all of those on my website.
Yes, they're so good. And you're so generous with your offerings. The SlowFI meetups, I think I referenced a couple of times, but they are like this, where they are kind of hosted together and you can connect with people in the chat, but you can always watch them after the fact. I highly recommend, if the experimenting one was interesting, to look that one up. And, shameless plug, Jessica had me on her channel last week to talk about the fears and the anxieties around SlowFI. So that is another one where we go a little bit more in depth of how to face those very real fears. Jessica, thank you again for being here, for taking the time. And again, you can find her over at the FIoneers. Bye, everyone. Have a lovely, lovely day.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, Lindsay.
Oh, my pleasure.